Thank you. I'm not going to add too much on this conversation other than the fact, because I think the results are what the results are. And one of the things I've noticed, even in yesterday's presentations, were that there's some consistency across the provinces and country in terms of the results we're seeing for boys and girls. You've got the results here for Alberta, and you can see that girls are generally doing better than boys. Now, if that's something that we're seeing consistently across not only our country, but in other countries that are doing the EDI, then for me, the bigger question is it really a gap? Or is it just that we're measuring boys' development differently, right? I mean, so if boys are consistently doing more poorly than girls on the same measurement, maybe the measurement's off. Maybe it's just that we think that boys and girls should develop on the same trajectory at the same pace, but that the areas of strength for boys are not leveraged. So the EDI is not intended to actually look at strengths. It looks at sort of deficits, right? It's a good measurement for the bottom part of development, but not necessarily for the top part. Now, having said that, there's some boys that are doing extremely well as well. So I think what we have to look at is how do we better support both genders in a system that likes to treat everybody with sort of the same brush. In Alberta, some of the challenges we've had that might suggest or might play into this are, one, we have a lot of absent fathers. And that's partly due to the fact that we have a lot of people coming into the province to work, families, and then the fathers go up north to work on the oil and gas industry. So they're oftentimes gone for 2 weeks at a time while mom stays at home taking care of the kids, very young kids. And when dad comes home, sometimes the last thing that they want is to spend 48 hours interacting with children. They have many other things that they need to do while they're in town. So that, I think, might be a contributing factor. One of the other contributing factors might be the feminization of not only the school system, but also sort of the education system in general. The way we teach is not necessarily the best way for boys to learn. And we know that. We know that there's some research that suggests that boys sitting in a desk trying to learn academically is not the best way for them to engage in the material and to really integrate it into their body of knowledge. So we've had some schools that have tried some really innovative things. So for instance, to try and teach literacy, they use shaving cream, they use sand, so that boys can actually use their bodies to interact and learn how to write letters and how to spell. And those strategies have proven to be quite successful, actually. So I think when we look at the differences between boys and girls, rather than looking for answers to a question that might not be the right one, we need to ask more questions and figure out, okay, what is it that data might suggest? And might it be that we're just using the wrong measuring stick to look at boys' development? Yeah.
Give me just 1 minute to change the slides.
Oh, yeah. Which one do you want? Up here.
And if you can go here. Thanks. And maybe yeah.
Oh, here's that.
So I will, I'll echo some of the comments and a few different things. I struggled with this question when I was presented the question for a number of reasons. When we look at maps, and not this particular one, but when we look at the maps I showed earlier with the different EDI results, you don't see gender differences in the maps. We always present the results at the community level for all the children in the community. But people are often interested in gender differences for some of the reasons you just mentioned and for a lot of other reasons. And when it comes to looking at the different vulnerability rates for boys and girls, we often have to acknowledge that, as Lynn just said, their development is different. We know that from a lot of research that they develop at different pace. We know that girls, when it comes to social competence, maturity, they are often more advanced during the first few years, and that has to do with gender differences of the brain and the socialization and what have you. So whenever I think of gender differences, I go the same direction. It's not so much about talking about worse or better, but about differences. But we can think about differences in terms of gender. We can think about differences in terms of culture, in terms of social context, and then the question is, what do we do about it? So what I'll do is I brought a few slides that have to do with differences in regard to multiple different aspects, and gender is just one of them for me. And so what I brought here is a map of the lower mainland for Vancouver, the lower mainland of Greater Vancouver in BC. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the geography of that area, but so this is Vancouver here. So this is coast, the water, and then you have the mountains here, West Van, North Van, and Surrey. So it's a large area of different cities that have grown into one big metropolitan area. And the colors you see represent the population that comes from different countries of origin. So yellow is for Eastern Asia, red is for Southern Asia, and then you have blue, that is light blue is for Europe, dark blue is for South and Central America, and so forth. So you look at this diversity, then on top of that you have gender differences, then on top of that you have socioeconomic differences. The moment you take all these differences, all these determinants of health, to put them together, in every community you have a unique constellation of what it means to be a boy in a community that's mainly Punjabi speaking. What does it mean to be a girl growing up in a community that's mainly Cantonese speaking, or where you have half and half? What does it mean if you're a Cantonese girl where you're in a minority versus majority? So you put all these different pieces together, and then the question is, what do we do about it in terms of how we approach education, how we approach early childhood development, and so forth. And I'll just show you. How many of you have actually seen the different items on the EDI? Okay, a handful. Or maybe you're too shy to raise your hand. I'm not going to test you on this. I'll just go through it for a couple of minutes to remind us what are we actually asking when the kids, or what are kindergarten teachers actually filling out when they go because when you look at the 5 domains of the EDI, the constructs are fairly abstract. What exactly is social competence? Well, it's a broad construct that has a lot of facets to it. These are not all the questions, but just an excerpt. Let's start with the one that may be relatively familiar to many of us because it's a traditional way of thinking, early academic or pre-literacy, pre-math skills. So here are some of the questions that the teachers filling out. They're not worded as questions, but just as a construct. So how would you say this child is able to handle a book? Identify letter, put sounds to letters. Are they aware of rhyming? When it comes to reading and writing, can they read simple words? Can they write simple words? In terms of numeracy, can they count? Do they know the numbers 1 to 10? In numeracy, we don't see a gender difference. It's the one where we don't see a gender difference. And in fact, when you go into grade 4 and grade 7, it's usually the boys that are doing better in terms of academic. Again, I'm not the first to go there and say, well, then that means boys are better in math. What does it mean in terms of how we socialize, what we expect from the different genders in terms of what to be good at and what to, maybe disregard? When you do the adequate teaching in terms of reaching the different genders in the appropriate way, as you were saying, if you build letters in the sand or you have scientific concepts by climbing through the trees, maybe that's appropriate for some. If you talk about numeracy and math and science in a certain way that speaks to girls in a way that's different than we traditionally talk about science and math, you reach them. So again, it's always about how do we reach our children in ways that are appropriate for their level of development and for their cultural and social context. So let's take and in terms of time, you keep me on track. Yeah. Okay. Let's look at social competence. This is where we see large gender differences, but we also see large cultural differences. We see large differences from one community to the next. So look at the different items that are on here. The first one is overall social competence. This has to do with whether you get along with your peers, whether you're cooperative, whether you play with different children. So yes, it's about the competence of the child, but it's also about the environment, of course. It depends whether you get along with the other kids in the classroom. It also depends on who the other kids in the classroom are. It also depends on the perception of the teacher. What do you think it means exactly? I mean, there are certain constructs of what we mean by getting along. So maybe there are also some gender differences in how we define these different constructs or how they play out. Look at respect and responsibility. This has to do with following rules, being respectful in regard to property, showing self-control. If you think about following rules, and I'm not saying that's a right or wrong thing, there is often the way gender, girls and boys are socialized, following rules may sometimes play out differently how we parent and how we teach boys versus girls in terms of following rules. And again, I'm not putting a value on it. I'm just saying we have to reflect on do we actually expect the same thing from boys and girls from different cultures and so forth. The same with regard to approaches to learning and classroom interactions. And then here are some items from the emotional maturity scale. So this has to do with whether children are hyperactive and inattentive. Then here's some questions about aggressive behavior, whether children get into fights, whether they bully others, whether they kick others, whether they take things and so forth. And then there is a domain on anxious and fearful behavior, whether children are unhappy, fearful, worried, or not. So you see there's a lot of very specific questions, and all of these often have meanings in regard to gender difference, but also in terms of how we socialize our children, cultural differences and so forth. And just to, do you have a couple more minutes? I'll just show you a couple of slides. These refer to cultural difference, just to kind of shift our perspective, how we can look at differences in numerous different ways. Because there's such huge cultural diversity in BC, yes, we get the question about gender differences, but we get the question about any type of differences where we see a lot of variability in our communities. And one of the questions we often get is, well, how are the Cantonese-speaking communities doing compared to the Punjabi-speaking communities and so forth? And those are the two that are most prevalent or prominent in our groups. And what we sometimes have done, I'll walk you through this slide quickly. We have looked at the individual subdomains of the EDI. So here you have physical health and well-being, social competence, emotional and maturity, and cognitive development. So you've seen those different domains before on the EDI. You can break it down into these individual components, which I showed you a few ones. And then for the entire population, we say, okay, what's the average score for the entire population? And that's where we put our 0 line. So the horizontal line you see is the average across all children in the province. And then we put just the English-only speaking kids against this line. And you see they're very, very close to the average because it's a large majority of our kids. 80% have English as their, or 80% have English as their only language background. So basically that's our overall average, if you will. And again, it's not meaning that they're good or bad, it's just our reference group. This is a majority of our kids. And then we look at the Punjabi-speaking children, and you see it's not about better or worse, it's about being different. And then you ask, well, what does it mean to be a Punjabi-speaking child? How do they get socialized? What are the expectations for these kids to come into school being school ready? What does it mean for girl versus boy to be school ready? And then if you turn the question around, what does it mean for our schools to be ready for the population that's coming into the schools? So it often has to do, and this coming again back to your point, if we understand that children come with all these different ways of being socialized and having different biological makeups and what have you, and you put all these pieces together, if we understand that, then we may be in a much better position to work with these communities, engage with their parents. So just a couple examples. If you look at the Punjabi-speaking kids, they show strength in regard to their emotional regulation and their gentleness. That's where they score much higher than the average. even the ones, there are two lines because we looked at the bilingual children. They know both English and Punjabi. That's the dotted line. And then the solid line is the kids who are only speaking Punjabi. They're usually a little lower. Even the children who don't speak English, so they struggle in the context of kindergarten because they you can't communicate well in the language of instruction. Even those are rated more highly when it comes to the respect and so forth than the overall average. And then you see others in terms of the pre-academic skills where they are rated below, especially the ones who don't understand the language. So again, it's not about better or worse, it's understanding where the kids are and then doing things that are developmentally, culturally, and socially appropriate in order to engage these kids in a way so that they all can learn. So I'll stop it there, thanks.
I'm going to take a different approach as well, because I think in Australia, I think you saw the results yesterday, boys are reported as having difficulty nearly twice as much as girls. And one of the things that I do is I am on a research excellence, I belong to a research excellence centre, or a centre of research excellence in child language. And what I will do is I'll leave a research snapshot with Julie. But this particular project was looking at why parents seek help about children's communication development in the early years. And what they found in their research, and this was Australian and American studies particularly, and the UK, where they have found through this work that parents play a particularly vital role in promoting and observing their children's development. And so if the number of families who access help increased as the children get older, but children with communication problems were more likely, their parents were more likely to get help. So children who couldn't communicate, who might have underlying emotional and social difficulty, those parents were more likely to seek help. And as those children got older, the parents would actively go and seek support. Yesterday, there was a study being presented and they mentioned maternal education. Clearly, if mother's level of education is high, they're more likely to identify difficulties earlier. But the study was actually being conducted to try and help understand why parents try and access support about their children when they couldn't communicate very well. And I think what they were finding was that between 0 and 4, parents were more likely to access help for boys than girls, which is almost predictable. And they were looking for help because children with obvious communication problems had more difficulty in their social settings. And I think most of us would be aware that boys' language generally develops more slowly than girls' language, and there is obviously some correlation there, which you know more about than I do, you academics. I don't. I'm just an observer. But the important thing is that boys will often display difficult behaviours when they cannot communicate well, and we all know this. And gender does play an unexpected role in accessing help. If a boy does have problems, then even taking account parental concern, some of these boys are more likely to need help in the early years. And so in some ways it becomes a little bit protective. Boys who have difficulty communicating, who exhibit emotional and social difficulties, having the language difficulty or the communication difficulty becomes a protective factor. This is actually very interesting to those who actually do interventions with children around speech and language. And so I suppose what this is telling us that there's a greater need for parents to be focused on support and education. And if we engage with our parents and we help them understand the indicators for poor social and emotional engagement, we're more likely to be able to intervene early and help them. In some of these studies that have been done, very often in government, people who are writing policy, they say, we want to get in early, we want early intervention, we want to get in at 2 years old or 4 years old and assess these children. But many of the children who are assessed at 4 years old don't have any problems when they're 7 or 8 years old. And this is becoming more and more evident in the language research. I'll leave this paper because I think it's an interesting one for you. It does speak about the fact, or does speak to the fact that parents do access more with boys than girls if there are social and emotional problems. And that might tell us something also about girls having social and emotional problems. If they have good language skills, perhaps they're less likely to get some support. So parents really need to be well educated around this issue. In every single study we do, boys don't do so well. Parents complain about the boys. Mothers complain about the boys' level of activity. And I think, you know, sometimes if you come from a family like I do of 8 children and you've got 4 brothers and 3 girls, I can tell you as a child, the boys were terribly exciting. The girls were a bit boring, but as I got older, the boys became more challenging and the girls were the ones that sort of coalesced or sort of came around the boys and helped them out. So, you know, I don't know what that tells you, but anyway.